So a very warm welcome again in the name of everybody who's organizing this, hosts, organizers, and the initiative, etc. We have Mr. Mccoy Johnson from the Ministry of Climate and Environment in Norway, and Mr. Simon Maestre from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment in South Africa. They are both, South Africa and Norway are forming the strategic partnership for DSI informal processes, and they'll say some more about this themselves. And then there's Mr. Andreas Getkant from the ABS Capacity Development Initiative of GIZ. So I invite Gaute to start and maybe turn on your camera to provide a few words of welcome.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Dear all, welcome to this webinar under the South Africa-Norway Bilateral Environmental Partnership, facilitated by the ABS Capacity Development Initiative. So the session 14/20 from 2018 under the CBD requests the Open-Ended Working Group established under decision 14/343 to consider the outcomes of the extended ad hoc technical expert group and to make recommendations to the conference of the parties at its 15th meeting on how to address digital sequence information on genetic resources in the context of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So the global dialogue on DSI under the South Africa-Norway Bilateral Partnership was established to foster informal exchanges on DSI, but also to increase the knowledge base on DSI. This reflects the fact that DSI is still regarded as a complicated issue. Therefore, it is extremely important that we are guided by science when we make our political choices and deliberations. We are now heading to Geneva for the resumed session of the Open-Ended Working Group, where DSI is one of the topics to be discussed. Therefore, this is a very timely webinar, indeed, where we will hear from some of the leading voices in the field of DSI, which will present the newest reports and findings on potential approaches to access and benefit sharing and DSI. Thank you, and over to you, Simon.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Distinguished participants from all our UN regions, invited expert speakers, all stakeholder groups, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the government of South Africa to this important update session on the new studies that are focusing on potential of the ongoing discussion topic under the Convention on Biological Diversity and other multilateral fora regarding digital sequencing information on genetic resources. Distinguished participants, this webinar was organized in the context of the ongoing Norway and South Africa strategic partnership in facilitating informal global DSI dialogues in support of the formal processes, with technical support from the ABS Capacity Development Initiative. This webinar was organized as a contribution in the preparation for the upcoming resume session of the third Open-Ended Working Group on Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in March 2022. I hope the outcome of this webinar will assist in your preparation for the upcoming CBD negotiations on DSI. South Africa is very proud to be part of the community of nations that are committed to ensure conservation of biodiversity, sustainable utilization of its component, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits derived from the utilization of genetic resources, including DSI, for the present and future generation. With these remarks, I hope this update session will help to further advance the work on DSI under the Post-2020 GBF, CBD, and the Nagoya Protocol on ABS. And therefore, I wish you all a fruitful discussion. Thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. And finally, Andreas Getkant, would you please turn your camera and microphone on and provide your words of welcome? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. As the program coordinator of the ABS initiative, I'm very much pleased to welcome you all to this webinar organized by the initiative and under the auspices of the Norway-South African Partnership on DSI on recent studies and potential approaches on ABS. Since COP14 in Sharm el-Sheikh, the ABS Capacity Development Initiative has accompanied this discussion on DSI by delivering several webinars, workshops, and studies. Our intention has always been to offer a platform for the free exchange of a broad set of stakeholders about this new and challenging issue, which has raised a lot of interest in the last 3 years and is part of a groundbreaking development in the way we are producing, storing, and using information on genetic resources in times of digitization. Also, after the Geneva meeting, the initiative stands ready for the open exchange with the aim to deliver the diversity of perspectives regarding DSI and of course, other important issues regarding the third objective of the CBD. We have now come to an important moment since next month, finally, the discussions of the parties to the CBD will be resumed in Geneva after a long period of working together from our computers. Also, regarding DSI, time has come that the parties of the CBD have now the possibility to exchange views on the way forward. We want to assure the presence of diversity of perspectives and opinions while we feel united in the promoting the fair and equitable sharing of benefits in the sake of the conservation of biodiversity, its sustainable use, and better living conditions of the communities which live from and with the biodiversity on this planet. I would like to thank very much Tim Hodges for his excellent work in preparing this session and also the availability of the authors of the three studies that will be discussed here. And I wish us all a fruitful and constructive meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. So everybody can already see my picture, so I'm sharing my camera later, and now I'll move right back to sharing the screen for our agenda for today. So we've already had the welcome by South Africa and Norway Partnership and by the ABS initiative. After my brief overview here, Suhail Al-Janabi will provide some background and context of this webinar, some framing, and then Tim Hodges, whom I'll introduce later on, many of you will know him anyway, is going to present some key elements of these three new studies that you have already also received with the invitation. So one on national ABS approaches to DSI, existing experiences and analysis, some lessons from multilateral mechanisms, and a paper on the virtues of DSI benefit sharing for the common good. You'll hear much more about these studies later on. After this, which will be a quite compact presentation, and I invite you all to concentrate well because a lot of information will be coming, we'll have an initial kickoff exchange among the panelists, which Tim will then facilitate with the panelists, and they will discuss a few initial questions. And throughout all this, as I said earlier, the chat will be open, and my colleagues Hartmut Meyer and Suhail Al-Janabi will be screening the chat throughout the entire time, and will then see whether there are, what kind of major issues maybe, or topics or questions come up in the chat. And then they will present these clusters of topics or questions to the panel for discussion, because we've got, I don't know exactly how, almost 200 participants. So we need to kind of organize this discussion. And this is what we've chosen, the approach. If you've been at the last webinar, you know this procedure. It has worked actually quite well. And then this will take almost the entire time. And just towards the end, the APS initiative will make a few further announcements and then close the webinar. Very briefly on the chat and the comments, questions and answers, etc. You can type comments and questions in the chat throughout the entire webinar. As I said earlier, please ensure that you send messages to everyone. It says that in your chat application so that everyone can actually see them. We cannot actually follow questions that go only to panelists or so. It's too many different channels. And as I said, Hartmut and Suel will be screening the chat and compile aggregated questions and comments, and will then provide these to the panelists later on. And any remaining questions and comments that we cannot address in this webinar will inform topics and orientations of future webinars and dialogues. With this, I hand over to Suhel, and maybe just without stopping to share the screen, you will just hear a new voice. Most of you, I guess, know Suhel Al-Janabi. But Suhel, you might also want to turn on your camera, so some people might be able to see you. And Suhel will provide some context and background of this webinar.
Yes, thank you, Catherine, and good time of the day to everyone. I believe almost everything that is on this slide has been said by my previous speakers. The framing, the mandate coming from COP14 to support a science policy-based process, in which is then the frame, the cornerstones of the Norwegian-South African Environmental Partnership. That we did already quite some dialogues, webinars, and so on has already been said. And yeah, finally, really, this is with our informal events to support the formal intersessional process, which is currently preparing for the working group 3, but then, of course, also further to COP15. Next. I will keep it quite short, but I think this is an important process, of course, maybe the key process we are currently facing and that will guide us, which is the informal co-chairs advisory group that convened a couple of times end of last year, and which reported back then to the co-chairs, the executive secretary of the CBD, and finally, of course, will do with that report to the working group. So this is probably one of the key elements to be discussed and then featuring into the DSI-related discussions at the working group. And next, it is the report that you all probably know, and I just want to make a link to next, the core, what we find in that report, of course, which is this performance metrics, the multi-criteria metrics that has been established to assess the different options that are on the table for discussion. Our option 0 until 6, and that should guide then assessing them with respect to their contribution in terms of attaining the policy goals, the implementation, how difficult or easy it is to implement these options. Then, of course, the aspect of good governance, and finally, of course, whether or not the different options are coherent with other existing systems and adaptable and be future-proof. So let's call it, this is probably one of our future core working documents. And we believe that with the webinar today, at least to some of the aspects that are relevant to assess the options, some background could be provided, and also some reflections, in particular when it comes to the probably core question on if there was a DSI governing system, would that be footed on a bilateral or on a multilateral framing, or could it be a mixture of both, and what are current experiences with such systems and approaches? And I think with that, I'm now handing over to Tim to finally get to the substance matter of today's webinar. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Suhail. Before actually handing over to Tim, I would like to introduce Tim. I guess most of you will know him, but I would like to say a few words about him for those who don't know him. So Tim is actually Timothy Hodges. He is Professor of Practice in Global Governance at McGill's University's Institute for the Study of International Development. At the same time, he is also a principal of an international consultancy that provides strategic advice. Tim is actually a former career diplomat with 3.5 decades of experience in multilateral, regional, and bilateral affairs. And I think many of you will know Tim from his role as co-chair of the negotiations that led to the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol. So he is really more than just an observer and an expert, but really into all the topics, and will now provide an overview of the 3 studies. Tim, please. And I will, as soon as you tell me, I will share the screen again.
Very good. Thanks very much. Thank you, Catherine, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, I'm hardly an expert in DSI, but I do make the claim that I'm the only one taking part in this webinar today that's likely to have read all 3 of the studies that we will focus on today 3 times. So I've survived the studies, reading them 3 times. That makes me more expert than some. So again, it's a pleasure to be here. I will introduce the panelists, but I think I will introduce them when we go to the actual panel session. So please, panelists, be patient. Your time is coming. So if you could screen the first slide, please, Catherine, I'd appreciate that. Good. Thank you. So this is going to be a very short presentation. I have at most 20 minutes, and Catherine will stop me if I go over the 20-minute mark, please. And I would simply like to provide you with some highlights. This is not a comprehensive overview by any means. It's simply a set of highlights. And I'll begin with the first study, which is written by Henri de Novion, who you know well, I'm sure. And it is an assessment of 3 approaches, which he calls scenarios, to the regulation of DSI in national ABS regimes. And these 3 approaches, the impacts of these 3 scenarios or approaches are measured through 3 perspectives. And I will get into that shortly. But in terms of the scenarios, we have 3, as I mentioned, and these are actually extant. These are existing approaches, archetypes, but they are actually, they are real. In the one scenario, we have an absence of ABS regulation per se. The second scenario, we have ABS regulation regarding prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms, pick back. And finally, the third scenario, we have open access under terms and conditions. And for example, in the case of the third scenario, that is very much like the Brazilian approach, as I understand it. Next slide, please. So the evaluation criteria, this is a set of what I would call positive characteristics that Sirkaya from the University of Ghent identified back in 2019 in a paper, and further sort of refined through a survey of a range of users and providers a year later. And these are quite familiar, I'm sure, to everyone on the webinar. Things such as legal certainty, low transaction costs, fairness, transparency. These are all considered to be good things if you want an effective ABS system. Next slide, please. So through whose perspectives are these things examined in? Well, through the provider, the user, and the data bank perspective, naturally. And I do not intend on going through all of three scenarios and the outcomes of it, but we'll get to the conclusion shortly. But this is just a depiction from the executive summary of Henri's study, which is a pretty straightforward matrix. You have on one axis the provider user data bank columns, and then the other, of course, these positive characteristics of an effective ABS regulatory system. And of course, the cells are filled in and measured. Next slide. So we go through the three scenarios. This is the second scenario, and then the third. Next slide. So this gives you a sense of what was, how things were measured and how they were depicted. So conclusions, and these are my conclusions from Henri's study. And of course, the panelists will have an opportunity to correct me very shortly on whether or not I got it right or wrong. So I think the major conclusions that I draw from the bilateral study is that feasibility of tracking and tracing DSI description and use under a purely bilateral approach is largely extremely costly and entangled or complex. Secondly, without DSI use, benefits will hardly be generated. And I think that's obviously quite notable. That conclusion. And finally, frequency of use should be fostered, not regarded as a transaction cost, as is in the case of all three scenarios. So again, frequency of use should be fostered and not regarded as a transaction cost, as they are under the three scenarios at the moment, and generally speaking, I think. Next slide. So take-home messages. So the messages I took home from Henri's study, well, the best way to articulate them is, in fact, to quote Henri, in this regard. And one is that the DSI description and use regulation could perhaps be better addressed through a multilateral governance structure to be subsequently implemented on a national level. And secondly, and this is actually Henri quoting Paul Oldham, who many of you know and a widely recognized expert in many things, including DSI. Paul said, I think back in 2021, however, timidity does not help solve global issues. Timidity does not help solve global issues. Bold thinking that moves outside the box or reconceptualizes the box can assist with identifying effective, workable solutions. And I think this is an important take home, whether it's about DSI or really anything else in terms of global governance and global problem solving. Next slide, please. So this is, of course, the DEFRA sponsored study on multilateral mechanisms. Next slide. And it was commissioned by DEFRA to provide a rapid case study review. So rapid, is quick and dirty, as I would call it, review of multilateral mechanisms in a range of fields to draw out lessons which could support international discussions ahead of COP15. So in other words, it's sponsored in order to provide a wider evidence base to the parties to the CBD, so for everyone's benefit, including, of course, for the benefit of the UK. But obviously, it doesn't represent the view of the UK government. Next. So the purpose, to study the operational models and governance structures of in this case, 4 multilateral mechanisms. to outline the resources that are required for these mechanisms to be set up and run over time, to highlight some of the technical rules, requirements, and associated processes governing decisions and disbursement of funds. And then finally, and importantly, to outline some lessons and the implications of each mechanism, which are relevant for further discussion, of course. Next. So the case studies chosen. There's a methodology behind this, and perhaps Chloe would like to get into that if someone's curious about it, but I think it's pretty obvious and pretty sound. So ultimately, the consultants identified 4 case studies: the ITB GRFA, the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, the PIP framework, you will all know, under WHO, the Voluntary Lions Share Fund, and finally the GEF, Global Environment Facility. Next. So let's get to the lessons right away. In terms of funding mechanism, the study found the following. In nearly all cases, funding remains reliant on just one source, most commonly public sector contributions that are actually not directly linked to the utilization of a genetic material or use of those resources. So one source, mostly generally public sector contributions. A stable funding mechanism is important to support long-term planning and operational activities. Stable funding. Thirdly, private sector contributions require the right type of incentives to remain stable. Payment upon commercialization may not actually generate meaningful levels of benefit sharing, and voluntary contributions can in fact be quite unstable. Finally, payments can be linked to commercial benefits, so the link is not overly direct. Non-monetary benefit sharing is hard to establish, track, and enforce. So quite interesting. Next. So in terms of looking at the case studies, in terms of the distribution of benefits, it finds the following. Recipients of benefits in the mechanism do not need to also be the providers. Mechanisms use criteria-based approaches to allocate benefits, where the criteria are linked to the priorities of the mechanism. Third, monetary benefits are typically shared through the funding of projects. So benefits flowing through funding of projects. Finally, monitoring and evaluation is actually a core function, providing assurance and accountability for monetary benefit sharing. So monitoring and evaluation being important. Next. In terms of governance structure, there are core components of benefit sharing governance. One is a secretariat or governing body, GB, to manage and govern the mechanism. An evaluation team, either as an independent office or as a team within the mechanism is used. And finally, an external advisor group to oversee the mechanism and guarantee its accountability and transparency also needs to be functioning. And this is quite interesting. The administrative costs of a mechanism governance may be the region of 10% or more of the total available mechanisms fund. So upwards of 10% go to, in fact, to administrative costs. Next. The third study we're featuring today is Margo Bagley's Just Sharing, the Virtues of DSI Benefit Sharing for the Common Good. Next. Now, Margo's study is somewhat different than the previous 2 studies in that it in part is a review of DSI, its history and its evolution to the current day, but it also casts forward in terms of what to do about DSI in my terminology. And I think it is, regardless of how you feel or react to the conclusions of this study, regardless of how you feel about the conclusions, I think it makes a very, very constructive contribution, as the other 2 studies do, to understanding DSI and to wondering what we do about DSI. But it's also an excellent example of what I call real world relevant scholarship. And as a professor of practice at a university, I'm very interested in real world relevant scholarship. Next. So Margo begins with a review of a successful development of Ebola drug. And it's almost operates as a case study, a very current and interesting live example of what I call a poster child of the problem or the opportunity known as DSI. And by doing so, we're reminded DSI is just one example, but an important example of how at the moment, and we have been struggling internationally, globally, with the fact that we're constantly, often playing catch up with technological advances. So the policy reaction, the legal reaction to evolution in technology is of course lagging. And DSI is, I think, an example of that. Next. So what's at stake? I think the analogy in the study, this analogy is quite an apropos one, a very thought-provoking analogy, where much as the digitization of music and movies facilitated a flow of online peer-to-peer copying that threatened the prime revenue streams of the music and movie industries, the monetary benefits that developing countries were expecting to flow from ABS through the Nagoya Protocol seem to be threatened by declining need for researchers to seek access to tangible genetic resources once sequence information from those resources have been made publicly accessible. So a few lines, but actually I think a good encapsulation of what we're up against, by at least from some people's perspective. So I think it's a good rendition. Next. So these are exaggerations, I think, in my mind, but I rather like the phrasing here to depict the two opposite competitive viewpoints and behaviors, actually, in terms of DSI, where some users might say, what's yours is mine and what's mine is mine. In other words, I can use your resources and not share any monetary benefits I generate from them back to you. And on the opposite side, we have some providers saying, what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine. And this is where we own the DSI and you need our permission to use it and must share with us significant monetary benefits from whatever you create, using it no matter the size of the actual DSI contribution. So these are, I think, somewhat exaggerated, but they do make the point and highlight sort of the motivations and the motions behind the issues. Next. So I'll get to the prescription maybe at this point, where the study, Margo says, monetary benefit sharing is just and necessary both to fulfill all three objectives of the CBD and perhaps even to basic human flourishing. Without monetary benefit sharing, necessary investments of financial and human resources to conserve biodiversity, which of course benefits us all, and aid in socioeconomic development for the most vulnerable among us are unlikely to occur. So monetary benefit sharing is just and necessary. An interesting phrase. Next. So I'll be brief. Part one of the study is really background on CBD and Nagoya Protocol. I think it's well worth reading, even for the seasoned ABS and DSI negotiators and experts. And I think it's a potted history, but it's a useful one. Next. Part two is really a review of the definitional scope issues raised by DSI. And in part two, it unpacks the three main sets of views on DSI. And these will be familiar to everyone. Next. Part three, what to do about DSI. These assertions are made. Benefit sharing matters. IPLCs matter. The current framework is inadequate to deal with DSI, but it's possible to improve the current system from within to deal with both tangible genetic resources and DSI. Now, some of you may disagree with the fourth bullet, and some may disagree with the third bullet, and some may disagree with both the third and the fourth bullet. But I think it's very difficult to come up with a compelling argument why we should disagree with the statement, benefit sharing matters and IPLCs matter. Finally, on this slide, the use of the word tangible. I haven't seen it that frequently of late, but it does remind me that as far back as 2004, well before the adoption of the protocol at an international experts meeting in Cuernavaca in Mexico, sponsored by Canada, Mexico, with the support of Switzerland. At that very meeting, my good friend and former fellow co-chair, Fernando Casas, actually wrote a paper and delivered a paper on tangible versus intangible genetic resources and information. So it's not as if DSI and the value of information was unknown and could not have been predicted. And in fact, it was discussed, again, even 6 years in advance of the adoption of the protocol. But for a range of reasons, as we know, the negotiators in the wisdom had other things to do. And of course, the protocol was never meant to be comprehensive. And it certainly is an example of what's possible rather than the art of perfection. Next slide, please. So what to do? The study recommends recognizing some guiding principles. And I think these are, again, very recognizable and I think largely shared. Just to highlight one point, and that was the final proposed principle, which is interest convergence. And this is the point about ABS, DSI, and what happens with DSI in both the CBD and beyond. It should be a win-win situation. In fact, it can be a win-win situation. And again, in my mind, ABS and in fact, DSI, yes, problems perhaps, but actually, I think it helps if we try and view them as opportunities. Right? These issues are difficult, but they're actual opportunities. Next. So the conclusions of the study. Global benefit sharing mechanism, Article 10, could ensure open access while providing meaningful benefits for biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, and economic development. This can only happen through strong political will, less greed from users and providers, and recognizing we're at a pivotal moment in the health of our planet. Next. The takeaway message. Just benefit sharing can improve conservation, socioeconomic development while maintaining access and innovation. But getting there will require adjustments in mindsets from mine to ours for both users and providers of physical genetic resources and DSI. Next. And thank you very much. We're going to now move to our panel session.
Yes.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm very impressed. These three really very detailed and long and interesting studies to actually present them in actual 20 minutes. So congratulations on this. Apologies for this going forth and back on the slides. Somehow my computer was doing things that I didn't even touch it by itself. So, and also a brief remark, I've seen occasionally that participants are raising hand. Unfortunately, we are not able to allow questions from the floor because with over 200 participants, it's just not possible. You are always welcome to write questions and comments in the chat. Please be sure to post them to everyone. And then clusters of issues will be presented to the panel later on. But now I hand back to Tim. I will stop sharing and he will introduce our three panelists for today. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And we have our panelist cameras on, please. See, Margo, you're on, Chloe, and Ari. Thank you. So again, it's my pleasure to be with you, and it's particularly pleasurable for me to introduce this esteemed panel. Many of you will know all three panelists, and it's really quite exciting to have them together for this event. I'll start with Margo. Professor Margo Bagley is Co-Associate Dean for Research and a Professor of Law at Emory University School of Law in Atlanta, Georgia, USA, with a specialty in patent law. She is a technical expert to the Africa Union in WIPO and on digital sequence information issues in the CBD. And she served as a member of the CBD's ad hoc technical expert group on DSI information on genetic resources. And as many of you will know, Margo was involved as either lead author or co-author on 3 commission studies related to DSI and ABS, 2 for the CBD and 1 for the FAO-IT. Next, it's a pleasure to introduce our second panelist, Henri de Novion. Many of you will know Henri, of course. He has dedicated almost 10 years to ABS regulation. That's a long time, Henri. As you also know, he is former director of genetic heritage at the Brazilian Ministry for the Environment, from which he is currently on sabbatical. He has extensive experience as an advisor for ABS compliant value chains, international processes such as CBD, FAO, the IT, and BBNJ, as well as for national implementation. Last but not least, I'd like to welcome Mccoy Johnson to the panel. She is a member of the CBD team in DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK government. Her background is in ecology and conservation. She joined DEFRA's CBD team back in 2019, working on DSI and ABS from the beginning, and now she in fact is the lead on DSI. Chloe was the lead on 2 DEFRA Commission studies on DSI, working closely with ICF Consulting Services Limited, who produced both. The first study, an evidence review of DSI, was published in 2020 and is also available online, and maybe we can pull up that link before the end of the webinar or at the end of the webinar for those who are curious about the first study. So a warm welcome to the panelists. So as indicated at the beginning of the webinar, we're going to start off with a few warm-up questions, what I call warm-up questions, followed by 2 more rounds of questions from me. And then the floor will be open, and you can already start to contribute some questions, which will be collected and then posed back to the panelists. So let's start with the first question. Excuse me. And this is a pretty easy one, I think. For the panelists, could you please tell us if the highlights identified from your respective reports are the ones you would have underlined? If yes, is there anything critical you may wish to add? If no, what did I miss that should be brought to our attention? So an easy one. We'll begin with Henri and followed by Chloe and then Margo. You have, as you know, maximum 3 minutes each. Henri, please.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. Yes, Tim, you got it right. I appreciate your synthesis, and I would like just to highlight that I did not want to be an iconoclast with this study. I mean, CBD's bilateral approach was agreed in a context in which access to the potential value of a genetic resource, its biological information, was deeply concentrated in the collection of genetic material under national control, and thus subject to conditions to be agreed on before its use was made possible. To apply regulations designed for a scientific context, biological information obtained from tangible genetic material, to another one, biological information obtained and exchanged through the internet, would be like trying to regulate music streaming by applying instruments designed to regulate music recordings in cassettes. With that in mind, a possible approach to regulate the use of DSI could be one focusing on results, outcomes of DSI use, like patents, products, and so on, instead of processes such as downloading, exchanging, using, as in the case of my music analogy. I would like to underline, as in Margo's study, that whatever the approach adopted is, it has to be future-proof, because technology advancement should not be viewed with reservation by providers, trying to minimize potential losses with bureaucracy. Neither should be an excuse nor opportunity for users to evade compliance and benefit sharing obligations. We should reconsider regulating ABS based on techniques and expectations. Otherwise, we will be constantly chasing technological advances, and more than that, getting frustrated. I don't want to sound repetitive, but if we change the paradigm and regulate concrete outcomes, results of the use of biodiversity components, in spite of how science advances, outcomes will invariably result in scientific papers, patents, and products, which are priced, monitored by national checkpoints, and more easily integrated into the Nagoya Protocol traceability system. To conclude, we may wish to consider the need of this future-proof paradigm shift. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. Chloe?
Thank you, Tim, and hi everyone. It's lovely to be here today. As you have very aptly indicated in your highlights, the aim of our particular study was to look at multilateral mechanisms and provide key lessons from them in relation to funding, operations, and governance. You have already provided a really great overview of those lessons, so thank you very much for doing that. It's also just worth me saying a huge thank you to our consultants. They were the ones who worked incredibly hard with us on this study, so a huge thanks to them. I would just like to add a few extra points to those that you have made as part of your overview. Firstly, on why we chose these case studies in particular. So working with our consultants, we determined that these case studies would provide a useful insight within the DSI policy context. The mechanisms reflected within our study are certainly not the only examples available, but there are areas of relevance to the multilateral options currently being considered within wider DSI discussions, and especially when we think about what modalities may be considered. Being able to analyze these mechanisms and seeing how they work in practice provides a useful insight into what can, or in some cases may not work so well within multilateral approaches. It was also very important that our consultants had the opportunity to speak with those working within the mechanisms where possible to help improve their analysis and ensure there was sufficient information available on each mechanism. This meant we were able to hopefully produce an interesting and comprehensive review. And just on a second point, in terms of what our hope is for the study, in terms of its wider impact. So we wanted this study to be readily available for parties and stakeholders and ultimately be a helpful information resource as we move through the wider DSI discussions. But our hope was that it could be reviewed and interpreted as needed and help build on our collective understanding. I think as we progress with the wider DSI discussions, I think it's important that we identify and make explicit where there may be gaps within our understanding and where analysis such as what we have undertaken with our study may help plug these evidence gaps. It would be, I feel, incredibly useful perhaps as an outcome from today to get an understanding from participants where they think further gaps remain or where there are areas for further exploration perhaps. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chloe. I must say it's difficult not to interject to some of your ideas and those of Ari as well, but this is not about me. It's actually rather about you and your studies. So over to Margo.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to the organizers of the webinar. So I do think that you captured the highlights of my study. What I would add is that because there's been such a lack of trust in these multilateral fora, something that you and I have talked about before, and not just the CBD, but across fora, it seemed to me that folks were often talking over each other, not always listening to each other, and not grasping that each side had some legitimate concerns and each side had some unrealistic expectations. And showing the legitimacy of the concerns on both sides, as well as the detrimental views on both sides, was very important to me, as well as trying to suggest a middle ground approach that could possibly provide a win-win if properly designed. You are right, I did exaggerate in my views. That's kind of my warped sense of humor, but it just seemed to me that that's what was happening on the extreme ends, of course. But I also wanted to bring out that benefit sharing is not just about greed, as some might perceive it as being, and there is greed on both sides. Benefit sharing matters, as you pointed out. It matters, and it should matter to all of us in light of biodiversity losses, and the vast amounts of uncharacterized biodiversity remaining to be assessed. Going through various reports on climate change and biodiversity loss, I'm like, we really need to, this is a moment that we really need to focus on and see how to address this. And IPLCs provide all of us with an invaluable service in stewarding biodiversity, and they should be recognized for doing so and be able to share in the benefits resulting therefrom. And that's it.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Let's move to the second question now, and I think we'll start with Chloe, and then to you, Ari, and then Margo. And it's a simple one again. Was there anything surprising in terms of the findings or the analysis that you undertook for your studies or commissioned for your studies? Is there, and I'm not looking for an institutional response, but rather as an individual who has been involved in DSI and very familiar, of course, expert, all three of you in DSI. Was there anything surprising in terms of the findings for each of your reports? Chloe?
Thanks, Tim. And well, I would say there was probably relatively few surprises that came from our study from my perspective. However, there were certainly some findings that came out that made us think a little bit more, especially in relation to the multilateral mechanism funding and governance. And in particular, as you've pointed out, the fact that administrative costs were higher than anticipated for the mechanisms. So each mechanism considered within the study appears to rely, as you rightly pointed out, to a certain degree on a variety of funding streams. And this is to help provide a level of assurance and certainty that funding will be available. In some cases, this is partly through the voluntary contributions or donations, alongside other funding streams, such as payments upon commercialization, as we know. One of the lessons from the study indicates that instability from external economic factors can also be an issue, and so hence the need for multiple funding inputs. Our study has highlighted that the admin costs of mechanism governance are high within multilateral mechanism examples. And as you have rightly pointed, they may be in the region of 10% or more of the mechanism's total funds. So the issue of funding and the need for robust admin processes to ensure a mechanism can function properly could be a point of contention, we feel. One aspect our study did not look at is how admin costs are covered in bilateral mechanisms, for example, within the Nagoya processes. But I understand within Henri's study, administrative burden is a consideration within the regulation scenarios. So this is incredibly useful and provides a helpful context. Given the importance of any future mechanism being reliable and fully operational to secure user buy-in, having a reliable funding stream and robust admin procedures is an important consideration that shouldn't be overlooked, in our opinion, especially when we're designing or looking to agree a solution. So our study certainly gave us something to think about in this regard. Thank you.
Absolutely. Ari, next.
Thank you, Tim. I would add two personal thoughts. The first one, I think it's important not to focus excessively on trying to set regulations to avoid free riders. Instead, focus more on the creation of regulatory environments that stimulate those users that are willing to implement biodiversity-friendly value chains to abide to ABS laws. Regulatory environments that are attractive and provide benefits for the compliant user. The implementation of simplified ABS measures may contribute to reducing the benefits of being a free rider, but free riders will avoid regulation no matter how easy and facilitated it may be. Eventually, free riders may be required to prove compliance. When that day arrives, ABS regulations should give them the opportunity to regularize their products and the opportunity to comply with past and future benefit sharing obligations. We need ABS regulatory environments that create the conditions to bring misconduct into compliance, what I call regularization. And the second thought that came to me, which is linked to the first, is that we have to invest in mechanisms to increase users' commitment with compliance and benefit sharing, so the cost of rewriting gets prohibitive. This could voluntarily arise from a company's own desire to benefit from having a compliant product, or as a consequence from the growing and conscious demand of consumers requiring verifiable, sustainable narratives, and also willing to pay more for that. Surely that market power could enhance users' willingness to comply, but without effective user measures implemented in users' national jurisdictions, those incentives may not be sufficient. Regardless of the given model or approach, without effective user measures, no matter how innovative and facilitative a system may be, it won't deliver the desired characteristics of an effective ABS system. To conclude, those are two important pillars: realistic and feasible access measures combined with user measures effectively implemented, meeting their objectives and delivering the expected results, benefits for conservation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so tempted. No, Margo, please.
Okay. So as you noted in your overview, Tim, my paper is a bit different from the other two in that while it is a research-based study, it was not a commissioned study. So when you speak of surprises, it's, but I did actually have surprises going through the process of the research, and a couple of things that stood out. One from talking to actually someone in industry was, as we went through these various issues, is that DSI benefit sharing is actually important to all three objectives of the CBD, not just the third. It's important to conservation, it's important to sustainable use. If the folks who are involved with conservation and sustainable use do not have the resources or not properly incentivized to engage in that conservation and sustainable use. And through other work that I've done, I provide examples in the paper relating to that. So that was an interesting point. Also, you mentioned one analogy to music and movie digitization, but through the process, I saw several analogies, imperfect, but nevertheless analogies, to other kinds of concerns and behaviors that we grapple with. So one, for example, it seemed to me that in some cases, some provider countries act like some US university technology transfer offices who have been criticized for making the process of licensing out technology, patented technology developed at a university, so difficult and so protracted because they're afraid of missing out on a really lucrative multi-million-dollar product, that they try to include onerous reach-through provisions and contracts. It takes years to negotiate. And I'm like, well, you know, that's kind of the same kind of complaint that we're seeing here in some cases. And the behavior on the part of tech transfer office officials has resulted in some companies avoiding US universities and going to universities in countries outside of the US to partner where they don't have these same kinds of restrictions. And that makes me think of the way that some researchers say that they avoid using genetic resources from some countries who are perceived to have onerous ABS laws and regulations. And as I said, the analogies are incomplete, but they can be helpful if we can look to other areas where we see similar problems and how those problems may have been resolved. They may provide helpful ways to move forward. So those were two things that I guess you could kind of call them surprising as I was doing my research.
Well, thank you. This is fascinating. We've got just under 10 minutes left to go, and I've lobbed you some very easy easy balls to hit. To use a baseball analogy, this one may be the pitch may be a little faster, but I can't help actually but pose this question. And it's kind of like the pink elephant in the room. And let me be quick. It's a fact that bilateral regimes have been established in, I guess, in most countries actually, as per the protocol. And of course, these bilateral national systems have been put in place, as I recall, in part at least, if not principally, for countries to assert their sovereign rights over their biodiversity, their genetic resources. So this is an example of countries asserting their sovereign rights over genetic resources. And while it's true that you can actually assert your sovereign rights by joining a multilateral regulatory regime voluntarily, signing on, I mean, I think more obviously, the Negotia Protocol is about asserting sovereign rights. And of course, that's the way we've gone, the bilateral approach. But now we're confronting the reality, I think, as you might have said, Margo or Henri, that we have a call for establishing a multilateral system to deal with situations such as DSI. So we have the chosen approach, the bilateral, but now we have a problem that some will argue, and including some of you on the panel, that we need a multilateral approach. So the simple question is this, can both approaches, I should say, coexist? Do we need to choose one over the other? Are they mutually exclusive? Or is there a blended approach? Is that possible? Is that feasible? Is that tenable? I don't mean in a political sense, but rather from your expert views and understanding. Is it possible here to actually have both or only one? That's a big question. That's more than one question, actually. I don't know if anyone wants to take a crack at it. If you don't, I think I may have some answers, but I'm not going to provide them today, and we'll just move to open up the floor to webinar participants. But maybe Margo, you might have something to say on this, or others. If not, we'll move on.
Sure. It's a lot of questions, but my answer is yes. If we're going to have a multilateral mechanism, I think it's going to have to coexist with bilateral, at least in the short term, at least initially, because as you mentioned, the Nagoya Protocol explicitly embodies a bilateral system for tangible genetic resources. And you mentioned tangible, and I use tangible simply because as a lead author of another study, I know that not everyone is agreed on whether genetic resources, and I'm not going into that, I'll just use that term. But I think because the multilateral systems we see, and Chloe's study did a great example of laying out some of those, not all of them, like the plant treaty, for example, have been unqualified successes in terms of generating funds. I think some countries will be understandably skeptical and unwilling to jettison the bilateral approach for an unproven multilateral approach. Like I said, at least initially. And of course, it can depend on how it is designed. And then the sovereignty concerns is an issue that I've also heard from representatives from some countries. So I would expect them to coexist for some period of time. And that's what I point out in my paper. Also for prior informed consent in relation to associated traditional knowledge, the bilateral approach might not be going away anytime soon. I do think, however, that a multilateral mechanism can be used for DSI across jurisdictions and across fora, marine biological resources, et cetera, because the way DSI is used by researchers, by companies, by scientists is the same. It's used a certain way if it's coming from a marine organism versus from a plant. So I think we could have some synergies, efficiencies across fora and across jurisdiction. As to whether we need uniformity of approach, uniformity has its benefits, but as a legal scholar, I will say I'm also in favor of legal experimentation as a way to identify the features of the best approach that we might want. So kind of agnostic as to the uniformity aspect, but I'll stop there. I know we don't have much time.
Thank you. Yeah, uniformity, we've seen that word a lot more frequently lately from several quarters. Ari, baby? Anyone else on this one? No. Go ahead, Ari.
Thank you again. Throughout my life, team, I have concentrated my analysis on a purely bilateral approach for ABS. And undertaking the study was an opportunity for me to test my own convictions on the limits of such approach to implement a cost-effective regulatory system for DSI. I'm now more convinced that a multilateral approach will most likely be cheaper for everyone and more feasible than trying to bilaterally identify the origin and legal provenance in every DSI use. The fundamental idea of bilateral approach was to make benefits return to conservation in the country of origin, providing that particular genetic resource. The way DSI is described in use defies this logic, and bearing this in mind, we should be asking which approach is more likely to cost effectively deliver benefits for conservation in countries of origin. To my mind, the multilateral approach has greater chances to reduce regulatory difficulties such as transboundary occurrence, massive data mining, bulk data analysis, metagenomics, and so on. And what's more, it would bring additional benefits such as greater transparency, predictability, sustainable use of DSI, as well as potential reduction of transaction costs. In other words, the exclusive bilateral approach for DSI could work for few countries with enough market power to bear the costs long enough to collect benefits. But our challenge, the halt of biodiversity loss, is global, doesn't respect boundaries and national sovereignty. So who's going to bear the costs for the least developed provider countries? Or what about the IPLCs? I mean, I don't think it's just a matter of necessity, Tim, but rather it's the most viable option we have, the option that is most likely to deliver benefits for conservation. To conclude, either we as a global community find a mechanism that will work for everyone, including indigenous people, or it won't work at all. Recalling that with the adoption of the 2030 Agenda, UN member states pledged to ensure no one will be left behind. So I think this should also be the case for DSI. Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt very briefly. You're perfectly well in time. I just would like to highlight again, we see that some people are posting things in the chat to hosts and panelists, but especially the panelists have no time now to look at the chat. So that will not be observed. Please, if you have a comment or a question, make sure that you address it to everyone, then everyone can see it. It's also transparent, and it can be screened and considered in the questions to the panel later, where we are going to in a moment, I think. So thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I have to admit, I haven't looked at the chat at all. I've been actually valuing very much the presence of the panelists. So I don't know if we want to wrap up on this one now, or
no, it's just, I think else? You have one more answer. I think if Chloe still wants to answer to that.
Yes, please, please go ahead, Chloe.
Thanks, Tim. Yes, just very quickly, because I realise we want to have some questions from the audience as well. But just say Margo and Henri have made some incredibly helpful and useful points. If I may just add a short response to this. So we didn't explore this within our study, but the UK's perspective, and I am speaking in terms of the UK here, is that we very much acknowledge that there are some bilateral regimes within national systems and that these already exist, but we believe it would be really useful if more information was available on how successful these regimes have been. The ability for different approaches to coexist will likely depend on the modalities adopted. Ultimately, what is most important is, I suppose, establishing a system that provides certainty to users and facilitates access. It is paramount we ensure that important research can continue, which in its terms is vital to ongoing conservation for biodiversity, as well as protecting health and well-being, for example. also, as the UK, we have previously highlighted what we think are a useful set of guiding principles for a future mechanism, which, just to highlight, have included taking into account of and being consistent with international law, ensuring that science and innovation is facilitated and not hindered, and that any outcomes should be future-proof, which we've mentioned a little earlier. It should also take into account the needs of relevant actors. And what we've heard from UK stakeholders is that a potential outcome needs to be robust and also have sufficient capacity building as well. So just a couple of extra points there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chloe. So thank you for being on time, but more importantly for really some really wise and interesting, more than interesting, important remarks and thoughts. And I thought all three studies make different ways, make a tremendous contribution. I know there are more studies coming. I think we would all agree that they're very, very welcome. This is complex and not anyone potentially could have the answer. That's for sure, a series of answers. So again, congratulations. I also think the studies, they were fact-based. They're also very honest and open. And I think anyone who reads them will understand that these are developed by experts and experts who care and experts who want to make a contribution. So thanks very much. Katrin, I see that Andreas and Suel are standing by. So we're now opening up the floor. Yes.
Yes. So thank you very much, all the four of you. Just a reminder, I think the links to the studies have been posted in the chat. You should also be able to find them in your invitations to this webinar. And if you can't find them anywhere, they will definitely go into the report. As Tim just said, our colleagues Hartmut and Suel have been screening the chat and will now take turns to bring up some questions to the panel. And we hope, and I'm sure that these will be complicated questions, but the crisper the answer is, the more questions we can address. I think it is Suel who is going to come up with the first cluster of comments, questions, or whatever it may be. Suel, please.
And that's definitely not an easy task, causing some headache on how to bring all these things together and in what sequence to present it. But I would maybe start with a question or a comment with a very high cruising altitude, which is in particular now, there was a discussion on why a multilateral mechanism might be the more favorable approach. And so there was one statement that might then kick off a bit of discussion that said, isn't it that we're just now talking about a multilateral global taxation rather than a national taxation system when we are proposing this? And is that not equally, if we went that step, why only for digital sequence information? There was another comment that said, isn't this also a step to look at tangible genetic resources? So maybe Tim, this question, is it now lifting up from national to global in terms of a taxation system because it's profit based? And if so, why only DSI?
Well, that's an easy one. And I'm sure it's a very popular question. I mean, I'm always in fear when I hear people talking about taxation. And I think part of the question is, are we talking about double taxation, which is never popular. But in all seriousness, maybe we can have some people take a crack at it. It's sort of multi-layered question yet again. But let's see what the panel has to say, if anything, on this. Margo?
I'm happy to kick off, Tim, if that's helpful.
Well done, Chloe. Well done. Please.
First person to the fire. No, I think simply because our study did consider the multilateral approaches, there are quite a few helpful points and questions there. I think it is a tricky one in the sense that when we were looking at the studies, the case studies within our review, it was quite important to think about how this will impact, both the national and international communities. And I think many people have looked at the multilateral approach as something that could be potentially changed or adapted for particular circumstances. And I think there is some elements to that makes it quite kind of appeasing in some ways, sort of pleasing as a way forward. However, I think when we're looking at the options on the table for DSI and understanding that there may well be taxes linked to this, I think we need to kind of think about that quite carefully. I think certainly our study didn't specifically focus in on taxes and how that would function, but I wouldn't ever want to see a kind of a point where there are excessive taxes so that it would hinder, the science community or other communities per se. So I think we need to have a little bit more of a thought, give a little bit more thought to that, certainly when it comes to the multilateral approach, which I certainly think have some favourable aspects, but I'm not sure if we've kind of finalised how it could work in many regards. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would follow that with, the modalities are yet to be determined. And I give an example of an approach set out in a proposal by the African group for a user fee, not a tax, a user fee. But also, as I point out in the paper, DSI is a global problem that is in need of a global solution. So if we're talking about national, but we all benefit. And so, and looking at the principles for what would make it successful, having something global, though perhaps collected at the national level, just might be more efficient, maybe not. But I think it's just too soon to say in terms of the modalities. In terms of why not for genetic resources, well, that was the point that I was referring to, that the Nagoya Protocol deals with tangible genetic resources in the bilateral context. Currently, it does have Article 10 that says, maybe a multilateral system might be appropriate in some cases, but that's the status quo right now. And as I mentioned, some countries view or are concerned about sovereignty, and it's true, you can still have sovereignty in a multilateral system, but some have explicitly said, folks I've spoken to, are concerned about being able to control from a national standpoint access to those genetic resources.
Yeah, that's it. That's interesting. I recall during negotiation discussions about ABS and the international regime, and then the protocol. I mean, countries, there are proponents of the bilateral system, which were largely everyone, really, at that point. They were arguing that the bilateral approach, the national approach, could actually lead, counterintuitively maybe, but could actually lead to greater efficiencies through a more competitive approach to access and benefit sharing. So compelling countries, establishing regulation to make them efficient, to make them less costly, less bureaucratic, in order to entice users into their countries. So the idea was, the concept was, yes, bilateral, yes, national, but sort of in a competitive, positive competitive way, which is interesting. I'm not sure that we've seen that actually unfold, to be honest with you, but that was the argument at the time. Ari, did you have anything to say on this?
Yes, thank you. I actually fully agree with Margo, but I must say that I'm not only concerned with digital secrets information, and that is why I insist on the need for a future-proof paradigm shift for ABS. one focus on outcomes, regardless of the technology used. You see, it's not new that digital storage and exchange of information is limited in a non-stop evolving data usage context with exponential demand. The evolution of the tools and means to access and use biological information requires regulation also to be adaptable to these unforeseeable future contexts. For instance, although costs related to DNA synthesis, decoding are many times higher than sequencing, biological information described as DSI could probably be, in the near future, stored in DNA itself, back again. We could soon buy a DNA drive instead of a silicon-based disk drive, loaded with, for instance, the Crop Trust seed database, such as the one that the University of Washington and Microsoft already synthesized, encoding and decoding a total of 200 megabytes of information on the strands of DNA. To conclude, DNA itself may replace silicon-based materials as the next generation of information storage technology. And that poses further questions. Will this rematerialized potential value of the dematerialized genetic resource, a DSI in a DNA drive, be considered as genetic material subject to ABS? Now, instead of being conserved in silico as DSI, conserved in a not so new platform, in acidum, in nucleic acid. So how to address this and quantum computing solely with bilateral pick and mat with these old tools? I think that we really have to not try to see the future, but be prepared for it. Thank you.
No, that's very, very, very compelling. I think, Hartmut, are you ready to pose another question from the floor?
Yes, I'm ready, and thanks for calling me in. Well, it's yeah, it's a very rich chat, and I picked out one of the many questions which or remarks which was on Henry's study and on the user measures related to DSI, and then the remark that those countries which have user measures don't regulate DSI under their user measures. So I think, and this refers to, I think, the basic issue, which is also part of other chats, that many countries don't regard DSI as genetic resources. That's, however we see this, that's a fact until now. And so I would like to pose the question to the panelists. What could you think, or what would you advise countries to do with DSI and genetic resources? So how could this very basic questions be tackled and hopefully solved then? Because without a, let's say, without an agreement that DSI is actually under the CBD, any further discussions seem to be pretty complicated.
Right. Naturally, I think maybe already you want to tackle this first, but I do recall, of course, that amongst the three prevailing views, Margo has talked about that particular one as well. Did you have Margo first? Margo, would you?
I'm sorry. So the question of whether or not DSI should be considered a genetic resource. Right. So if you look at the CBD, if you look at the Nagoya Protocol, genetic resources are comprised of genetic material, and material sounds tangible. So it is true that there are countries that say that DSI falls within genetic resources, but I think it's hard textually to support that position. But the challenge with that position means then that DSI is subject to pick and map, prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms, which is problematic, as my paper describes, when you look at the way that DSI is used. I think a better way to say that DSI is within the scope of the CBD and Nagoya Protocol is to recognize that it results from the utilization of genetic resources, that it is not itself a genetic resource, but it results from the utilization, and therefore benefit sharing is required. under the CBD and Nagoya protocol. So benefit sharing from that utilization of a genetic resource that then from which the DSI is created. So yeah, that's hopefully helpful.
Anyone else? Marie?
Yes, thank you. Well, I think that we should not be focused too much on this discussion of definition exactly, and I fully agree with what Margo says, that the CBD already give us the wording that we need to interpret DSI as under the scope of the CBD, which could just say that it's a subsequent use and it was obtained from not an ex situ platform, but an online platform. But I think that we have so many other important issues that we didn't address actually regarding the DSI, which are quite out of the central discussions, which is associated traditional knowledge, for instance. There is ATK online in DSI. Just search stevia plant in the UniProt databank website. You will read in the description of the gene sequence involved in the biosynthesis of sugar in leaves associated traditional knowledge. You will read the following passage, and I quote, "Stevia leaves have been used as natural sweeteners in South America for centuries." But who has been using stevia for centuries as natural sweeteners in South America? The Guarani indigenous people from Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, and Paraguay, for instance. With a multilateral approach, transparency would be enhanced by national focal points and IPOC's representatives being able to collectively monitor those DSI's registries, including the monitoring of potential ATK use as DSI. Stakeholders' involvements, and there is in the chat, I saw that comment, including academia and private sector representatives on the designing and management of such multilateral system, could allow the flourishment, like Margo likes to say, of a regulatory environment with enhanced trust. And that is what we need in this relationship between providers and users and countries and stakeholders. It is trust. And maybe with a multilateral mechanism with enhanced trust, even genetic resources could be, tangible genetic resources could be inserted, as is suggested in the Margo study. The countries could voluntarily insert as in the multilateral system for the plant treaty. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else on this? You know, I must say that I've felt for a long time that lawyers would never solve the most complex and difficult issues, such including DSI. So a sort of lawyerly position really doesn't help, hasn't really helped, and hasn't convinced the majority of where they might want to go. But that doesn't mean that that should be ignored. I'm not suggesting that. I think legitimate positions across the range, across the spectrum. But I think we need to think, as Paul Olden would say, a little bit out of the box, and maybe with a few less lawyers, with all due respect, RV and Margo. Right. I think, Chloe, did you want to step in here?
Yes, if I may, Tim, just to add a couple of extra points to Margo and Henri's. In the context of DSI and kind of moving forward, I think certainly from my perspective, there are so many things to consider, as Henri's pointed out, and this is also including, you know, what DSI is ultimately. You know, we're constantly in that sort of circle of thinking about a mechanism, but also ultimately deciding what DSI is and the scope of it is as well, such as what was put forward by the RTEC. But it's, I think, quite fair to say that this could be an issue that goes beyond the CBD. You know, a solution that could be agreed outside the CBD is certainly something that could be, you know, more applicable more broadly. I think if we're thinking about, you know, other international agreements, which is kind of a core component of what we think is the UK, they should be factored into this. You know, when we're looking at mechanisms, we need to think about what potentially could be considered across those agreements as well, certainly outside of the CBD. So I think, you know, dare I say it, there's still so much to think about with regards to that, but it's kind of imperative that we I think focusing on what will help move us forward, and whether that is making a decision on the scope of DSI or the mechanism at this point. I think ultimately we want to just kind of move forward in a sort of in a collective way, essentially. So yes, certainly a lot to think about there. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you. Another good point. Yeah, and I guess part of the challenge is, and it's, again, nothing's impossible, at least in my view. Everything's possible, including like dealing with the fact that forms are really quite siloed at the moment. And, you know, in my experience, if you want to go to FAO and have a discussion at the FAO about what could be done about DSI, then you need to go through the Agriculture Ministry, and, you know, to make the point. So it is. I think we should be confronting the reality that this DSI is not in the CBD, and I do think it's possible to act globally, or at least in a coordinated manner. I don't think it's impossible. I think that's probably one of the challenges and one of the opportunities, in fact. Yes, Katrin, you're looking at me.
I'm looking at everybody. Yes, I would like to invite the next question from the chat, and depending on the complexity of the question and the complexities of the answers, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more rounds only, unfortunately. But let's try and go for 2. So Suhail would be next. Thank you.
Yes, one is a short one, as I just want to state one of the comments, which I find is noteworthy. It says lawyers benefit from transaction costs, and I don't want to comment on that, but there is certainly some truth in it. On another constituency, we heard from some that said that do not really agree that there is a declining need for researchers to seek access to tangible genetic resources, as for example in breeding, DSI alone is impractical. But it was also agreed that more and more, of course, of scientific research, academic research is going into DSI and ABS, and that there is a risk, what they say, if the transaction costs were too high and all models proposed could lead to some, what they said, massive political fallout, in particular with respect to the research community. So that would be a question I would like to pose. How do you see the discussed systems and approaches, including what you mentioned, Margo, these analogies to music and software? Where would researchers place in that? How much would it be hindered, and what would be best approaches to leave as much as possible space for access and use at the level of academia?
I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. One of the things that I propose is, or that should be considered in a system, is being able to differentiate between commercial and non-commercial uses. And so it's important to think about who is going to be impacted by whatever kind of fee is imposed. If it's posed on research tools, well, that's going to affect academic and non-academic researchers alike, and that to me is problematic. And so I think it would be better to have academic researchers be able to meet their benefit sharing obligations through non-monetary approaches, if it's possible to configure that. And a multilateral mechanism can have both monetary and non-monetary aspects to it. So I think that's something, I'm not sure if that's getting at your question, but
yep.
That distinction.
May I ask a supplementary question? How does, and if that is the case, Margo, and that's what you're suggesting, we consider, how do you distinguish, how does one distinguish between, you know, on the spectrum of research to development to commercialization? I mean, I think increasingly, I may be wrong, so you'll correct me, that it's that those phases are sort of muddied, they're intermingled, where you actually have academics, sometimes, some cases, quite openly, of course, sponsored by commercial interest to do academic work that may in turn actually ultimately be commercialized. Again, I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with that, ethically or otherwise, but how do you distinguish between an activity that's non-commercial versus one that's commercial, even though it's conducted by an academic? Right. Is it possible? I mean, I don't need an answer, but I'm just
I mean, it is a continuum, and you might have to draw some arbitrary lines. I think, because I can think of examples at my own university. If you look at molnupiravir, the drug that Merck is now selling to treat COVID-19, it was developed at a nonprofit that is wholly owned by Emory University, but was created to develop drugs. And it can get those drugs to what we call close to phase 1 clinical testing, and then someone else takes it farther. But that is unusual. Very few universities have academic centers that can take drug development that far. But you're right, it is possible. So I would think there would have to be some kinds of arbitrary lines that would be drawn as to between commercial and non-commercial.
Right.
Tim, if I may.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry, Henri, skip the cue there. If I may just add a very quick point, and this is sort of potentially just a bit of an open question as well. I think it's something that Henri and our study actually considered in relation to transparency. And I'm sort of thinking maybe there's a link there with regards to, you know, being open about transaction costs. So not necessarily thinking about, you know, what they would be, but I think if any sort of mechanism is quite transparent about its costs and use and things like that, there may well be kind of greater incentives for use, but also, you know, assurances that it's being, you know, benefits are being shared in the right way, essentially. So certainly within our study, we kind of came across transparency as kind of a core aspect of kind of getting stakeholder buy-in. I think considering that alongside how, you know, transaction costs or kind of the workings or governance of a mechanism may be going forward is kind of potentially quite helpful. So not really an answer, more of a kind of another point to consider, but transparency is certainly something that yeah, we picked up on in our study. So I just wanted to add that into the mix as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Henri. Thank you, Chloe, and on to you, Henri, and then maybe we'll have time for one more round, I think, hopefully. Yes, go ahead. Henri?
You're muted,
okay.
Henri.
Again?
No, it's fine.
Okay, let's try to organize my ideas. And I hope I'm not misunderstood what I'm going to say, but you see, in Brazil, we made an option, which was not to charge benefit sharing, monetary benefit sharing from all users that are obtaining benefits from it. You see, as it is quite described in my scenario number 3, only the finished product, which is commercialized, it's the one who has obligation to share benefits. Right. So we try to not lose our discussions trying to set a boundary between commercial and non-commercial, and just decided that the end user, the final link of the value chain, which is most likely be the one with the most added value in the chain, would be the one to share benefits. And with that, Brazil is expecting to gain different kinds of benefits rather than monetary. You see, because when you exempt patents, licensing patents from benefit sharing, what we are saying is that you don't have to pay for have a patent and not even to license it. But once the patent is licensed, it will be licensed for many other manufacturers to develop products. So instead of I request benefit sharing from one patent, I'll be requesting benefit sharing for 20 products using that patent. And the same it happens to the intermediary products in the value chain. You see, because if we start to charge benefit sharing in every link that has generated benefits, we will have a cascade effect and will be actually a non-incentive to none of the actors in the chain. So if we concentrate at the end user, all the actors will have the predictability to see that they will have an activity, they will be obliged to comply with legislation, to have peak and eventually register, but the obligation of sharing benefits, and that's mostly what Brazil has concluded, we have to require monetary benefits for those that are obtaining monetary benefits. And with that, I conclude saying that Brazil didn't just waive non-monetary benefits. We just consider that every publication, every scientific paper, every DSI, every intermediate product, every new channel, value chain that's going to be implemented, hiring indigenous people, local communities as providers of raw materials, but also as partners in this process. Because in the Brazil legislation, IOPLCs associations are not obliged to share benefits. So a company can associate to a community, association, a regional people or community organization, and be partner of that. In this case, we're not having benefit sharing, we're having profit sharing. And indigenous people are not just raw material providers, they are part of the value chain. And that's the idea we have in Brazil with ABS. We don't see ABS as a policy to collect money, but a policy to create innovative, sustainable value chains, new ways to do business, and with that, trying to create a new environment that at the end of the day will generate the benefits for conservation, but not as the monetary benefits, not our goal, but as a mean to achieve the biodiversity conservation. Thank you, and sorry if it was too confused.
Tim, can I add a clarification? Oh, Catherine.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. Basically, the time for this discussion is now up. I was going to say, let's at least go for one more, hopefully brief question from the participants by Hartmut with some crisp, famous last words in terms of answers from the panel, if that's okay, Margo?
Sure.
So to take one more point from the participants, and I ask you to hopefully be as crisp and to the point as possible. Thank you very much. Hartmut.
Yes, I hope we can be quick in that. And there are several contributions on my point, and also Henri just worked on that. So I think the trigger for benefit sharing now is actually access and utilization. That's the Nagoya approach. And as we know and discussed, that is difficult with DSI. And so imagine we would have a multilateral system. What for you would be appropriate triggers, because we heard that we should, let's say, more focus on the 3P, which are papers, patents, products, whatever. So what do you think could be good triggers for the benefit sharing in a multilateral system?
1 minute each.
Sure, I'll start. I like, and I mentioned in my paper, the approach that the African group has put forward of basically a user fee. Right now it would be on developed countries for products. So, and I agree with Henri there that products is where we should focus for monetary benefits. You're making use of it, and that's an easy is probably too strong a word, but a low transaction cost, hopefully, way of meeting the needs of biodiversity conservation and benefit sharing. So end user fee that could be paid by governments and go into a multilateral fund. But I still think it's also important to have non-monetary benefit sharing in terms of tech transfer, partnerships between researchers in developed and developing countries. All of these things are really important to making sure everyone can effectively use DSI at the same level, which is something we don't have currently.
All right.
Oh, sorry, was that me,
Microphone
Tim?
on? Yeah, Ari.
Oh,
ahead,
sorry,
Chloe.
Ari. I keep doing this.
Go, Chloe, go, Chloe. I'm still organizing my ideas.
To be honest, having a little bit more time is always good, and absolutely something to take away. I think, and Margo's made a really good point there. I think from our perspective, it's something that potentially we need to consult the users on as to what would be suitable as potential kind of triggers for this when we're thinking about a multilateral mechanism. You know, in that regard, what would be the most appropriate thing, and what would users buy into essentially? How will that sort of help with a multilateral mechanism and the associated triggers? I think it's something certainly I need to have a further dialogue on. I think we've kind of considered this as part of kind of some of our views from our side, but yeah, absolutely. I think it's all going to be part of where it sits with users. But as Margo says, you know, there's some interesting points made with regards to the options as well that are on the table. So looking forward to maybe discussing this further, especially as we move towards Geneva as well. Sorry, that was a bit of a political person answer, but yeah, looking forward to discussing further. Thanks, Tim.
Well, it's a good one, if a little bit cheeky. Is your microphone on, Ari?
Yes. Okay. I would just first to start say that a multilateral approach that still is focused on previous authorization and all this our current status is not going to work. And I will try to make a concrete example that why changing to the product will also increase compliance, as we know, because first, monitoring results rather than processes is cheaper and easier. In a prior authorization model that we are used to, be it a national authority or a future probably multilateral system, there will be thousands of access or use requests, which may or may not become a product or a patent. So our expectations. So let's take a conservative example to illustrate this. Let's consider that every 1,000 requests for access, perhaps 10%, 100, will really publish something. And from these 10%, just 4 will have a patent. And these 4, maybe 2 will be a marketable product, and just 1 will share benefits. If we focus in previous assets, be it the national authority or the multilateral system, we will have 1,000 users with 1,000 expectations to achieve a product. And they will have all the system having to monitor and answer and do all the obligations with 1,000 users, but only 100 published articles. So instead of having 1,000 users monitoring, we would have 100 publications being monitored. And the same to products and patents. Instead of 1,000 users being monitored, we would have 100 publications, 10 patents, and 2 products. And that's the question. Are we willing to create a system like other countries have been created to bilateral system that will have to deal with thousands of expectations, but at the end of the day, we'll have 1 product? The cost of creating a system to monitor 1,000 will be financed by 1 product. On the other hand, when we see the product or the results of the use as being the focus of regulation, we have an additional issue, which is when a researcher or a company is with expectations, their willingness to abide is probably lower than when it has already a patent, it has a product, it has a publication. When the user has one of these 3 products, he's the first one to desire it to be compliant because he's going to profit, he's going to benefit, be it because he's going to receive an extra mark as a good researcher in his curriculum, or because he will have a new product on market profiting. So if we still keep using the idea that we have to regulate expectations, we'll be burning money to not allow people to really develop the product. But if you change the focus to the product, the user is going to be an ally of us because he's going to be the first one willing to have the perfect information, because once he registers information, if it's not 100%, he will not complete the registration. You see, the idea of previous informed consent and granting permits is that the user just give the information to the national competent authority, and it's the national competent authority has to check all the information and give back and receive and give back, and that has a tremendous cost. But when it's the user who has a product and is willing to have it faster to the market, he's be keen to give the best information that he has. So we really have a different user in this situation. We have a user that is the first one willing to give the best information, while the other one, he just has an expectation that maybe or may not have a product or patent. So what's really committing him to be honest and transparent with the information he's providing? Just looking to add this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this was all three of you now. Am I right? Okay. Then thank you so much. We're approaching the end of this webinar, although we have a few pieces of information still, but I would like to sincerely thank all of you for the engaged discussions and the great questions, and in the first instance, the studies and your readiness to participate in this. I still sometimes see participants raising hands. We cannot take participants from the floor. Regarding the chat, very briefly, if you watch through the Zoom app, I don't know whether it works on a browser. You should be able to copy the entire chat if you want that. If you're watching through the browser on a desktop or laptop computer, then you might be able to just copy the whole chat, I mean, mark the whole thing and paste it in a Word file or something. All of this might not work on a mobile phone application. So we haven't tested all these options, but we have set the settings for participants to copy the chat. All right, then thanks. Tim, I don't know whether you would like to say a very few short words, because it is now basically the end of the webinar, but we have a few announcements of other studies as well, and the side event in Geneva, and I would like to take at least those 5 minutes for that also. So I don't know whether Tim or anybody.
Just to thank the panel. I think I found it very stimulating, very positive, and I leave a bit more hopeful than when I started the webinar this morning. So thank you very much to our distinguished panel. That's it from my side.
Thank you so very much, Tim. Hartmut, I think you have the famous last words for this webinar. Yes. Do you already want me to share the screen for the announcement?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Do that. Here we go. Share, and that's that.
Okay. What we like to do in the end, also to suggest reading to another study and a publication which is available first on the economic concepts of DSI. It's authored by Ruth Miller, Vogel and Angerer in 21, and it's available on our webpage. You can see that link below. We also can post that in the chat. And that study actually is on analyzing the 5 policy options on benefit sharing using 4 real cases of utilizing organisms and research and development and commercialization to illuminate, as the authors say, the advantages and disadvantages of these different modalities to the bilateral Nagoya Protocol approach. One suggestion of the authors is actually to be informed by peer-reviewed scientific literature from economics and related fields, and the report gives a big list of issues which were identified and then analyzed and evaluated against these different policy options. Well, it's crucial, and I think that is where we all work towards. What are the costs of implementation in the end? does it bring any money when we set up a certain DSI regime? And how could any of these benefit sharing systems really serve the two objectives of the CBD? I think these are major questions which also were on the table already in the global dialogue. And the authors clearly work out that two of these policy options are preferable under economic analysis. And I'm just ask for the next slide. Can you go? Oops. And this is just one example from that list of problems and the analysis that is. I just copied this one because, of course, that is also in the center of our discussion. But how would we see DSI in the context of the CBD? And as we also saw in the chat, that one idea to solve the problem is to actually regard all genetic resources and DSI, etc., under the topic natural information, and from there starting developing a new regime for DSI benefit sharing. Well, with that, I leave it to you. You can download the study, read it. The link is given, and we go to the next slide. That's a very new publication. Actually, it was published today, right during our webinar, and you, Amber Scholz and Hartmann Scholz, the lead author of this publication, also sent a message in the chat. So it's about 41 authors from 17 countries who actually try to deliver models and solutions from a perspective of non-commercial science, how the DSI system could be built up. Also, these researchers are members of a recently established DSI scientific network. You also find the DSI scientific network webpage here. It gives a lot of information about DSI, and especially analysis of the DSI, which is actually stored and used in data banks. Well, with that, I like to close this presentation of more new studies, and also with regard to the time, which is a bit advanced now, I like to close the webinar without much ado. I think it was, again, a very rich discussion. We, meanwhile, have many studies that deal with DSI, not only these 3 ones discussed here and the 2 ones presented by me, but if you screen the internet, the scientific literature, you would even find more contributions from various angles on the DSI discussion. We are going to provide a report on that meeting, which will summarize the main points, the main questions and answers. And with that, I like to end my remarks, and we will have a final evaluation of this webinar. Yes. Thank you for participation, and hope that we meet next time.
Thank you, Hartmut. Just very briefly, before everyone leaves, first of all, thanks everybody for being here, for attending and discussing in the chat and on the panel. Before you leave, please help us to improve our work and participate in a very short evaluation of this webinar at the end. With this, I also say goodbye, and see you next time, or see you in Geneva or wherever it might be.